We are now live on YouTube with the January 14th, 2019 meeting of the node.js and JSF Joint Foundation Bootstrap team meeting. We're joined by 12 other members, combination of board members, project maintainers, Linux Foundation employees, and interested stakeholders who are here on the call today to discuss a variety of stuff. We've got a full agenda that we'll jump right into. The first item that we have on the agenda today is an update on progress for some of the proposals that we have open. The first one is a 5-minute time box to discuss the CPC charter. As that is Michael Dawson's proposal, I'd like to hand it over to Michael. We have quite a bit of time later in the meeting to dig into specifics of this. So maybe we can keep this focused to get people up to speed on where the process is at right now.
Sure. I will just give an update. So there's 2 PRs open currently. Since our last discussion, I opened a PR which covered board representation, because that wasn't in the PR, the first PR that I had, and that came up last time. The proposal includes having 1 board seat for the chair, as well as 2 floating seats, which would be determined by the CPC. You know, they would basically decide what the process is for those 2 seats being filled. It also includes that for the first year, those processes would be, you know, 1 would be dedicated to the Node.js community to be basically elected through a vote of the members, with the candidates being, you know, a member from the CPC, from the TSC or the community committee, and the other one being similarly a vote of the members, with the candidates being members of the leadership of the non-Node.js projects. And that, you know, was taken to mirror a little bit of what I understood the CNCF was doing, but it's not fixed forever. It's basically, you know, that's the first year, and then in the following years, the CPC could decide what made sense at the time. The other updates to the base document since last week, Miles had a number of comments, so I've gone through and addressed those. The sort of most significant one was, you know, trying to be a little bit like, make it clear that there could be anybody can really show up and participate. So the approach that I took on that was to add you know, we had regular members and voting members. I added observers, and, you know, basically, you know, express that observers are, you know, part of the CPC. They can come at any time, and added a little bit of a distinction that, you know, regular members are members who've made a commitment to, you know, contribute on an ongoing basis. I don't think we necessarily have consensus on all that, but that's sort of the tweak that I tried to do in terms of addressing some of those comments. There were also a few comments which we can discuss later around, you know, should we be stronger in terms of the CPC, you know, enforcing some things as opposed to being a, you know, basically an arbiter or providing advice or support. So, for example, should the CPC be responsible for enforcing a code of conduct? And I sort of, there was that I thought we should go off and discuss in this meeting before we progressed too much on that front. So when we come back to the discussion, there's 2 or 3 things that I've called out that we should talk about. But I think that's a reasonable update of where it is since last week.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Does anybody have any quick questions specifically about this right now, or are we good to move on to the next agenda item? Okay, great. So the next item up is project progression. Jory, you'll take this one. We have 5 minutes for it.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So we had a really excellent meeting, I think, this morning, or actually just 2 hours ago, to talk about some of the outstanding points that are kind of important to get this to stage 2. The most you know, tricky being defining open governance as a requirement for top-level projects. Our conversation this morning, I think, was very productive, and we came away with a couple of action items to start to nail down a definition of open governance that will be sufficient to support JS Foundation projects at whatever, and any project really at whatever size they may be coming in, so long as they meet certain expectations to celebrate that core tenet of open governance. So that was, I think, really productive. We will probably start with something like the JS Foundation's mentorship program requirements as a jumping off point, and there has been an issue opened to kind of narrow that down. The other big action item was the identification of the gap in the code of conduct expectations, which there's been an issue open for that as well. And so I think we have a good basis from which to really start to proceed. That's what I got.
Thank you very much, Jory. Anyone have any questions or thoughts around that? We still have a bit of time. Okay, then we can move on to the next agenda item. 5 minutes as well. This is expectations, which is Tracy. But I don't believe that Tracy is here, and I don't believe that we have any real update to the expectations since last week. So maybe we just move on to the next item, unless anyone has anything to add. Okay, so the last one that we have on here from a proposal and update is the community board representation. So I had talked to a couple different people after the last meeting. We came up with this idea of the floating board seats, but we realized afterwards, after talking to some people last week, that it did not take into the account the possibility of an individual membership program and whether or not the individual membership program would have a director. And how that would be affected. So for context, and this is mentioned in the proposal, right now Node.js has 3 community board seats. There's 1 seat for the TSC and 1 seat for the community committee. Bylaws only activate when there's 2 platinum board members. We have not had to ever deal with that problem. So, but that is in the bylaws and something to be aware of. We also have 1 individual membership representation seat, which requires 3 platinum members to activate. So I kind of iterated on where we were at with Michael's proposal and made a specific proposal of how the 3 chairs would be allocated. 1 to the CPC, which doesn't have any platinum membership requirements for activation. It just always exists. Then there is the a floating seat, which is identical to the floating seat that Michael was suggesting before. It's a single floating seat. That single floating seat can be assigned by the CPC on an annual basis or a process determined. So for example, the CPC could decide Node will elect a representative, or the CPC could decide it will be an elective representative from anyone from any project. There's a number of different ways we could go about approaching that. And then the 3rd seat was allocated as a seat for the individual membership with 2 activation criteria, 1 being that there must be 3 platinum members, and the second being that there must be at least 2,000 members in the committee, in the individual membership program for it to activate. Some of the reasons that I like this setup, one is it is a number of different seats that can grow with the foundation. We would start off with 2 based on the way the foundation currently is, but we would grow into a 3rd as we have success in the individual membership program. I think that that would play really well as far as getting people onboarded and up to speed. It is very likely that both Tracy and myself will not be remaining as board members after the merger when new structure falls in. So if we end up having 3 new board members, it's going to be a lot harder to onboard than 2. But it does give us the ability to invest in the individual membership program and have it scale with that program. are there any quick questions around this, or is this something that we should jump into later when we get into the governance discussion?
Yeah, I'll just add, add that I had thought of the individual membership thing one, and I figured, at least I was guessing it would take a year or so to activate. So that's when, you know, the CPC could have used one of the other two floating seats to fill that need. But it's probably good we can get into the more detailed discussion later.
Okay, excellent. Does anyone else have any questions or concerns?
I think my only point is that we really haven't heard much in the Bootstrap committee meetings anyway about what the individual membership program is. And so I'm eager to just sort of understand what that is, and thus what its implications might be.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, at a very, very high level, and I'll let, you know, Tracy is the person to drive this. Although I think Adam, who's also been involved, is going to be joining us a bit late today. But the short version would be that it would either be a membership class or a support structure. That's not 100% clear from a legal perspective, and I know, you know, as we draft the bylaws, that will need to be figured out. But it would be a program that individuals from the community can participate in. I believe the targeted price would be $10. That program would in turn come with a number of different benefits, including potentially, you know, early access to certain things, discounted prices for foundation events, the possibility for partnerships with member companies. But I don't want to dig too far into it. There's a proposal that I'd have to find. But Tracy, Adam, I know Michael Dawson has been working on this, but there's a team that's been working on it for about 9 months. It's just been hard with schedules to get someone on this call who can give us a proposal.
I think it's just a matter of getting Jory the link to the latest proposal, because it's pretty clear what that is. I mean, the key thing to call out, I think, is like the board representation was always, you know, the proposals. Well, the group that came together, the proposal was that it only activate at 2,000 individual members, and the main reason behind that was because, you know, we've had a program, people haven't necessarily been happy with it, and there's been questions about whether it's like who it's been representing. So the activation as a certain level was an acknowledgement of, well, we need to show that there's enough members in this individual membership program that there's somebody that they're representing. But the board members, the board representation is really only a small part of what it's intended to be. You know, there's other benefits that we've listed out in the proposal in terms of, you know, why people would want to be members. And, you know, it includes, you know, a variety of different things along the dimensions of, you know, more touch points with the foundation and members of the projects, potentially some visibility for people, that kind of stuff.
So perhaps it makes sense for us to move on, and, you know, if Adam joins in, you know, the next 10 or 15 minutes, we can take a quick break to discuss it. Is everyone good to move on to the next item in the agenda?
Yep.
And Jory, just as a heads up, it's very hard to hear you right now.
Oh, okay. Yes.
I don't know if you're far from the mic or something. So the first thing that we have on the agenda here, and we'll make it, let's call it like a 5-minute time box, is organizing the next collaborator summit for Foundation, not just Node. So we talked about this briefly last week, and I know that there's been some conversations around it. The next collaborator summit's coming up end of May, the 30th, just before JSConf EU. So I guess that's what, the 30th and 31st?
That's right.
And so there was a discussion about expanding the scope a bit. I don't think that we had any objections in the meeting here. Was anyone part of the conversations in the last week that can give an update on where we're at?
I can probably give a brief update. So we have a thread to chat tomorrow morning, actually, with some folks from the JS Foundation and the Node Foundation to discuss like what a program could look like. And on the JSF side, we've pitched a couple of different ideas. And so I think tomorrow we'll probably look at what that tactically could be, if it makes sense, because we know that we're balancing the needs of the node working groups to have their dedicated breakout time. We also need to probably dedicate some breakout time for discussion of joint foundation programs, and would like to do some kind of celebration, some kind of meet and greet type thing to encourage cross community networking. So that's kind of the at least low level goals, or high level goals, I should say. And we hope to have like something tactically for people to respond to this week.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jory. Yeah, I think things are moving forward there. Do you think it's reasonable for people on this call? Do you think it's reasonable for us to close this issue now that it seems to have kicked off and we don't have any objections here?
I think so. If there's no objections from the Bootstrap committee, I think the work that's happening in the Summit repo is probably where people need to be looking to see that stuff progress. And I'm also happy to just make sure that the Bootstrap committee gets CC'd on things as needed and when it happens.
Okay, I've gone ahead and I've closed the issue and removed the agenda label. And we can come back with a presentation about it perhaps when we have more of an idea. Okay, so now to the meat of the meeting, drafting initial governance for the Merged Foundation. Time box is, I guess we have 38 minutes because we kind of blasted through the earlier stuff faster. This started as issue number 33, but it breaks into a number of different issues, including number 38 and number 37, around what the C3 and the CPC looks like. Although I think as of the last meeting, we had pretty good consensus that the C3 was not going to happen. So with that being said, does anyone object to me closing issue number 38 about what does the C3 look like?
The only thing I wonder is if we've captured all of the needs that we had addressed that the C3 might, be in charge of. Do we need to make sure that those responsibilities or those things are documented? I mean, that's the only reason.
I had gone through the project that was created and tried to pull those all into 65 with the CPC charter, but having everybody validate that nothing is missing would be good.
Yeah, so Jory, we'd still have the project board that has all of those requirements.
Okay, awesome. I just want to make sure we don't lose anything. Yeah, +1.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. Other issues that are discussed as part of this include the proposal for community board representation, top-level council shape and focus, which is issue number 52, and the CPC charter proposal, which currently has 2 open changes against it that Michael was just talking about. So I think a couple of the things that are in the air right now, and then Michael, please correct me if I've missed anything. From the CPC perspective, now that we have one top-level committee, we need to confirm how the representation from that committee will exist. So kind of parallel to this, we have the proposal that Jory's working on project progression.
Yep.
And while we don't know how all of that will work out, I think we have consensus that there will be some sort of concept of top-level projects, potentially name pending, but there will be some sort of graduation or graduated or top-level status of, projects that meet certain criteria get kind of extra privileges within the foundation. And we seem to have consensus around that. And that those groups will be the groups that make up the cross-project council. So the first hanging question that we have is Michael's proposal specifies how that committee would be made up. So we do need to kind of dig into the details there. Right now, it's made up by every single top-level project is able to vote 2 members to attend. Those become the voting members. You then have what are known as regular members. Anyone from anywhere in the foundation can raise their hand to be a regular member. The idea of being a regular member, though, is that it's part of making a commitment to regular attendance as well as participation. And then anyone from the foundation can show up as an observer, and observers can still fully participate in the consensus-seeking process. The only difference between observers and regular members would be the commitment to regular attendance and participation.
I guess one other difference too is that at one point it does say as well that there will be 2 voting members elected by the CPC from the regular members.
Okay.
So that would be one other subtle difference as well.
And so one thing that Michael and I were talking about as an alternative, although it introduces its own complexities, would be following a model more similar to TC39, where rather than the CPC being made up of individuals, the voting members are the projects. And the idea being that anyone can come and participate in the CPC, that when votes happen, a representative from each project, each top-level project is responsible for relaying the vote of the project themselves, but there wouldn't be explicit membership of the CPC aside from the chair and the director. This, I think, has the benefit of making it clear that there's not hierarchy and anyone can be involved, but it does have the potential risk of not having people be active enough and kind of things not getting done. So that's kind of the first thing to dig into here. Like, how is the CPC made? Where does that representation come from? Do people have preferences for either of those models or concerns with either of them?
The one thing I'm just going to jump in with as you said, that made me think, how does that work for the non-top level projects in terms of, you know, they all need to get together to send somebody, or like it's a little easier when it's a top level projects can send somebody to vote. How about for the non-top level projects?
Potentially in this model, the non-top level projects don't have a vote at the CPC.
Okay. So yeah, so having said that, it would be good to hear from other people in terms of what people think of the models.
So I think I maybe am not. Sometimes I'm daft. Maybe I'm not understanding the distinction super well. Can we try again? I'm so sorry.
The biggest distinction is having an explicit membership list of voted members. So each top level project explicitly votes 2 members that are on a membership list.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is where the CPC itself does not have a membership list. The members are the projects themselves.
So for example, Node would have a vote, but it would be not any one particular person who was identified as the one who was going to cast that vote. And somehow the project would have to figure out for every vote who was going to represent the project. So it could be somebody different every time.
So I think that particular approach introduces perhaps more complexity than is required, because I think what benefits not just the projects but also participants and observers is clarity around, you know, who has the the direction, the authority to cast a vote on a project, and if a project isn't particularly good at making sure that that's been made clear to the rest of the project or community, then it's potentially a source of conflict, where a published, you know, list of voting delegates kind of eliminates that you know, ambiguity and makes it a bit more clear, and it's also something that can be audited on some basis, you know, every 3 months or year or whatever, it's assessed, is this list still correct?
There's also a potential for less cognitive load for, say, members who are representing at one point chosen to represent the entire organization. If there's a lot of changeover between people just representing by some kind of internal process, then having chosen members who will be in the mind space continually for a period of time to be able to represent the organization as well.
Certainly my concern of the not having somebody elected too is I'm hoping part of the expectation is some sort of leadership at the CPC level, and I think that's harder if you have different people at different times as well.
It seems a bit chaotic.
Yeah, I'll concur too. I think that being project-based will add all sorts of complexities.
Okay, so I think based on that, it seems like people prefer the clarity and sticking with the members. Does 2 members per project seem like something that people can reasonably do? I know Node has the representation to do it, but for those who are here from the JSF, is that something that you think JSF projects will have the resources to do?
And are we talking about top level projects only, or different levels of projects?
Top level projects, because we're saying that they need to have 2 people voted to participate.
It's basically 2 from the each top level project plus 2 from the non-top level projects as a group.
Is there a hard line on that number? Is there flexibility?
I think
up to 2.
That's easily accommodated. The rationale I had between 2 was like, so for example, in Node, if we wanted to send one from the Node from the TSC and one from ComCom, that's just an example where 2 gives you just a little bit more flexibility than 1.
The flip side of that, though, Michael, which I would kind of like to push so that we're not making the committee too heavy, is whoever's going and representing the project of the committee should not just be representing their own viewpoint. They should be representing the entire project. And since there's open participation and it only matters when it comes down to a vote, do you really think that projects are going to have a massive split in vote direction?
Well, I don't know. I guess I'm just thinking like we did think it was important to have board representation, right?
But that's because people couldn't all go to the board, right? Like if there's open membership where anyone can come and participate in the meetings, it's only the votes where it's required. My concern would be, 2 active members doing all the work of the CPC. For a project the size of Node may be doable, but it seems like a lot to ask of for smaller projects, and then it creates this kind of like disproportionate effect if people can only find one person.
Yeah, I'm like I like 2 better just because of the flexibility, but I'm not, if everybody else says 1 sounds better, it's not that's not a deal breaker or anything for me. But it's kind of like, so I don't know what other people think on that front.
Well, on the flip side, it makes representing all the needs and concerns of a large organization, there's a lot of pressure there for one person to represent those well.
Yeah, but like, is it in the best interest of an organization to have 2 people who are going who are not on the same page? Like, it seems to me, for example, that like if we're talking about bringing a new project in, and Node is split about whether or not that project should come in, is the appropriate action to send 2 people, one voting yes, one voting no, which essentially nullifies the vote as if it didn't happen? Or are we better off like figuring that out in our own house and sending someone with something that represents the entire project's idea?
I see. Yeah, I could get
the risk of 2 people, Michael, is either we're doubling down on something or we're nullifying.
Yeah, no, I mean that's definitely a valid concern. And then you do have the question of if some project only sends 1, do they only get 1 vote versus 2? which isn't necessarily what you want either.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think we want to be encouraging projects to be coming with split ideologies or without having reached some form of consensus with the ideas they're bringing forth.
Right.
But are the two people who come, do they have the responsibility of maintaining the consensus of the entire group? Does that make sense? So like if the consensus of the entire group would be one thing, is it in their best interest or in their concern to carry that regardless of if they take a separate stance?
Yes.
Yeah, they should be representing their group, not, I mean, it's a balance, right? Like but.
With me on the board, Ben, it is a balance because I have both my own hat and a board hat. And with the board hat on, I have a fiscal responsibility to the foundation that I could actually be held legally liable for. And there's things that I'm privy to as a board member that I can't necessarily share. And so sometimes I would be in a position where I would have to make decisions that may not entirely align with all of the needs of the project because they align with the needs of the foundation. But it's a really slippery slope. It's really gray. It's not clear. But I believe, and perhaps, Andy or one of the lawyers on the line can chime in, I believe that's more of a risk as a board member, that kind of stuff, than as someone on a cross-project council.
Yeah, that makes sense.
This is Andy. That's correct. But one of the things that you might want to decide is that when you're outside of the corporate context, you can set whatever rules you want. So sort of the flip side to your question is you could set, expectations about if you're representing, particular subset, is your role to represent that subset, or is your role more like on the board where you're representing the viewpoint of the subset, but ultimately if there's a vote, you're supposed to vote for the well-being of everybody. So you have the freedom, and it might be worth figuring out how you want to exercise that freedom and sort of set expectations so that people come into the conversation with the same understanding of what their responsibilities are.
I agree that because certainly we want, the CPC to act as in the greater good as opposed to, so it is, I think there's still a bit of the balance there. The other thing I wanted to add is like, the other reason too I chose two initially was, for example, for the representation for the non-top level projects where you have a number of different projects, you might be able to find a compromise among two versus one, as well as, bringing on members from the active CPC members. It just gives you it gives you more flexibility in terms of numbers.
So one thing that I think is worth bringing up here, and this is something that Michael and I got into earlier, is how much of this needs to be in the charter versus the governance. And maybe this is something the lawyers on the call can give us advice about, especially when we're talking about membership. Because, for example, we're talking right here about specifics between 1 versus 2, and it's very hypothetical, but I definitely believe it will be one of those things where we'll try it out and we'll see what works and what doesn't work, and we'll have to do a bit of like actually doing it. And, from experience of working with the technical steering committee, we explicitly designed our governance in such a way that as much as possible was in the governance rather than the charter to allow us to be flexible about our governance. So how much about the membership rules need to explicitly be in the charter versus what can be in the governance of the CPC?
This is Andy again. There's a draft of the bylaws, that's been prepared, first draft of the combined bylaws. And then, of course, each organization has its current bylaws. You can take those as being sort of a guideline for what's appropriate to be in the bylaws and what's appropriate to be in the charter. I would say that as a generality, I would always look to put something in the charter before I put it in the bylaws, where it only relates to a group as compared to everybody. It kind of makes more sense from an organizational point of view, makes it easier to find things where you're looking for it. and you have more freedom and more flexibility in a charter than you do in the bylaws, where to at least some extent there's legal constraints that bear on how it needs to dovetail with other things or how it needs to be worded.
And to be more explicit, it was about governance versus charter, not charter versus bylaws.
Well, I guess I'm maybe I'm missing. So what are the two documents you're asking as between what and what?
So like in Node, the foundation has bylaws, and then the technical steering committee has a charter, and then we have a supplementary document called governance, which outlines how it works day to day. And so we have as much as possible in the governance document, because that's not something that's part of the board contract.
I'm sorry. I guess I would take, kind of a common sense approach. Classically, the sort of must-have in a charter is it defines scope, who can participate, what its purpose is, that sort of thing. If you were to look at, there's, 175 projects now at the Linux Foundation. If you look at that sort of representative sampling, you'll find that probably most of them have a charter and nothing more. They'll put all the rules of procedure in the charter. That said, if you want to have two separate documents, you certainly can have two separate documents. And if you're happy with, the way something is working now, I'd certainly stick with it rather than rip it up and start over.
Mm-hmm. But I think, Miles, I'm not sure actually, I don't think, in the things that need to be covered, I didn't hear anything that is extraneous in that document. And I'm kind of thinking we want to get agreement on those anyway, right? If once we have agreement on the approach, if we then structure it into two documents, that's probably fine. But the key thing is to kind of get to we think this is what makes sense, right? And if we have to cover who can participate, I'm thinking we do need to say, okay, and each project gets one voting member or two voting members or whatever, right?
Yeah. My gut on this and my intuition is to keep it as simple as possible, to have as few groups, as few lists, as few representatives, and to keep it as streamlined. I'm a bit concerned with two members from each group, with both voting members and regular members and observers, that there's just a lot going on and it will act as a barrier for people getting involved. It is kind of my biggest concern.
So we talked a little bit about the numbers, the 1 and 2. So I think that is sort of straightforward. We could decide what the right number is. The other one was the regular members versus the, currently it reads as regular members, voting members, and observers. And I think you're suggesting we just have observers and voting members.
That's correct.
And the sort of background that came up with regular members was that, I was writing out some of the responsibilities, and it was like, hey, wait a second, we don't want this to just be the responsibility of this small set, because, the voting members are going to be a small set regardless of whether it's 1 or 2. We want to have an inclusive group where everybody's part of, we have a larger group of people part of the CPC, and we can basically say that group is responsible for all these different things. And that's where we ended up with the, voting members have a subset of that total responsibility for the group. Regular members, which include the voting members, have the responsibility for the whole thing. And then observers, since they may or may not participate at any given time, are free to participate, but we don't really assign any responsibilities to them. And I guess I'm a proponent, because I kind of, from my perspective, I think that feels like we can get a larger group of people who feel like they're part of the CPC, because they can be the regular members, they can be listed. Talking to Miles, it sounds like you kind of think that might go in the other direction. So it'd be good to hear from other people whether they think it's going in one direction or the other. Because, the goal is to get to something we think the most people will believe is inclusive and something they want to get involved in.
So, I can definitely see what's happened in Node happening in this a lot, where we get people who become members and then drop off forever. Obviously, that would probably need to be, changed or addressed quickly. But being a member doesn't necessarily, to me, mean that they're going to be engaged. And we have seen this over and over again in Node. And having everyone who's not necessarily having a vote being or participating as an observer, I think makes sense because it allows them to be more fluid and allows them to drop off if they need to, or to participate as much as they want. And I don't think it necessarily draws that boundary. And I think that we can still enable, a sense of belonging by being enabling that in another way, other than having your name on a list, which it might enable a sense of belonging, but it is more harmful, I think, in the long run than it is helpful.
Andy, again, just as a general observation, the one good thing about governance is that the same issues pretty much, come up everywhere, and there's thousands of organizations that are doing what you do. And even though sometimes there's a temptation to think that, we're different from everyone else, for the most part, there's a hell of a lot more that organizations have in common than they have different. So as a generality, you're safer looking for another organization or a number of organizations that are like you, and look for ones that have really thriving individual participation and see how they're doing it. Because as a generality, you're always safer copying another successful organization than you are, sort of trying to figure out from a blank sheet of paper what will work. You may get it right, but the odds are better for you if you copy something that's already working right.
I guess a quick question to those of you on the call, like perhaps Sarah has some insight into this about other foundations and how they handle these committees.
I can add a little bit. The CNCF, which is one of the models that we've been using, has individual steering committees for the different projects. And then the technical oversight committee that exists for the CNCF is actually more focused about inbound projects and is not necessarily elected from the project base. So it's across all of cloud computing. So that's a very different model as opposed to, but they do also have contributors to this group. So there are, I believe, 9 seats, which are voting seats. And then they have a community of contributors, and everyone actually votes in terms of binding and non-binding votes. So on a mailing list vote, you'll see a lot of non-binding votes, which are just community people weighing in. So if the group with the binding votes is way off base, you can actually see that and maybe course correct. So that's one possible way of handling some of this.
I really like that, just for the record.
And are those community contributors, like, are they all the people in the project, or are they somehow identified somewhere?
It is actually, there are two different types. Anyone can attend the meeting. And then there are also people that are described as TOC contributors, and you do a certain amount of work and get elevated to that position after you earn that position by working and contributing to the technical oversight community group. And so participation is how that gets measured and then elevated. Again, you work first and then you get your credentials later.
Right. I think so that would be the closest that when what we have currently written would be the regular members. The main difference being that the regular members and what we currently have written are, if you've been a part of any one of the projects for 3 months, you can ask to become a regular member. So if we made additional requirements for becoming a regular member, it would be closer, I think, than to that TOC contributor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to state that I really like the idea of the non-binding votes from, say, regular members, I suppose, as a, barometer, so to speak, for how the community feels about a given, topic if we're taking the vote on it. I think that's really good.
Yeah, no, I like that too.
Same.
But then that does require people like us listing who can cast those.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't necessarily know. It does require that, or it doesn't.
Well, it does. I mean, I think, unless it sounds like in the CNCF model, it's not just anybody who can come and make that non-binding vote. There's when a vote takes place, there's a list of additional people who are on that vote and can make their non-binding votes. So you need to have that list, I think.
It is actually anyone who can make a non-binding vote.
Okay, so maybe it's the opposite then. You don't need to be a TOC contributor.
The TOC contributors are more about learning how everything works within the TOC and are potentially your bench for TOC leadership in the next election. It's a way to get yourself known and show that you are doing the work in the community. And my apologies, folks. I'm actually going to have to drop a bit early today. So don't make any decisions I wouldn't make without without me being about. Have a great afternoon.
So now that Sarah's gone, what decisions are we making? Oh wait, she's still on the call. Oops. So I think one thing that we could do, if people are up for it, would be I think we should merge the pull requests that we currently have. The two pull requests against the proposal that's stage one, and then I can take the action item, or Michael, if you prefer, to open a new pull request with some alternative language to kind of flesh out the ideas that we were just discussing here about like the different membership and whatnot. We can discuss it over the week and then aim to land something next week. Does that work for people?
Works for me.
Michael, do you have a preference between me opening the pull request and you opening a pull request?
So, I mean, that pull request basically, I guess if you're happy I'm happy for you to open it.
Yeah, why don't you land the ones you have, and I'll open it as kind of like a proposal of changes, and then we can just use that as a source of truth to work towards any changes we may be able to reach consensus on.
Yep.
And for what it's worth, Michael and I were actually talking about this earlier, as a process to think about for these proposals, to kind of stop from things getting stale. I really like the idea, especially as things are in stage one, that we discuss them in the meeting. We try to implement those changes during the week, and wherever those changes are at the following week, we land them and iterate to kind of stop things from getting stale. That's not prescriptive, but just a general way of thinking about these things and how to, like have good movement on it, especially with the weekly meetings. So two other things that were left. We only have 5 minutes left, so we won't be able to get into them too much. One is the board seats. It seems to me like we need to get a full presentation about the individual membership program to make a decision about that. Does that seem reasonable to people?
Yes.
And it seems like either way, are people comfortable with either Michael's proposal or my proposal, depending on our temperament on the individual membership, or do people have high-level problems with the overall allotment as they're set up right now?
I don't think we have any problems with the overall allotment as they're set up right now. I do have an action item from our earlier conversation to make sure that JSF projects understand the potential options here as they also weigh, whether they're going to come in as top level projects or come in as some other category of project, how they still have the ability to participate in this group, and despite maybe not being at that higher level. So yeah, no objections.
Yeah, one of the things that Michael and I definitely realized on the call today, because we just wanted to kind of get to the bottom of some of the notes that I had, but it was that both of us have the exact same intention with this, which is we want to minimize hierarchy and we want to make sure it's as inclusive as possible to everyone in the foundation. Michael, would you say that's an accurate representation?
Yes. Yeah, it's like we want to figure out what will make people the most engaged and contribute as much leadership as possible.
And so we were trying to think about how to codify some of that into explicit language in the charter as well, to make it part of the charter of the CPC to be, inclusive to all members of the foundation to participate. Which I think will alleviate concerns that some people have of potential hierarchy in the foundation as a whole. And then the last one, we got 3 minutes left, but we should spend some time at the next meeting going over the explicit list of responsibilities one more time and making sure that they're in line with what we, want to make sure the CPC is responsible for. I know code of conduct, for example, was a big one there.
Yep. Yeah, like there's a list that's in and out, and I think we should go through that and make sure we're all in consensus on where the line, because there's kind of a lines, and part of it's around enforcement versus should the CPC be enforcing things or just helping and advising. So it's where that line's drawn.
That's
excellent. So we've got 2 minutes left. Are there any hanging questions, concerns, or thoughts before we stop the YouTube stream?
No. She says not very confidently, but no, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, amazing work, everyone. Everything is moving forward. I guess one last thing is next Monday is Martin Luther King Day. I personally have that off of work, but I'm still willing to show up to the meeting. Should we still host next week's meeting or should we postpone it?
I was planning to attend, but I'll respect whatever everyone else's schedules are.
I probably won't be able to make it.
Yeah, me either.
Okay, well, why don't we just, I'll open an issue to figure out attendance, and if enough people say they can't make it, maybe we'll cancel or reschedule for later in the week. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Going to stop the stream now. For those of you who tuned in, thanks for listening.